Hey Tim, how are you?
Very good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And I was kind of intrigued with the topic that you selected for today because I've been kind of a follower of the Standish Group, but more in a different vein in terms of how they've been tracking how we as an industry have been doing with project success. But the fact that you've picked their latest kind of venture into something they call infinite flow, I thought was pretty interesting in terms of the future of flow. So let me just kind of give you some of my impressions when I first started. And I read this somewhere, and it made a lot of sense to me that in the time from the 1960s to the 1980s, the latter part of that is when I started my project management career. It was called the time of the Wild West. And I understand that because we just kind of did seat of the pants project management. Now,
Right.
mind you, projects were a lot simpler back then. But then they said that from the 1980s to 2000, that was the time of the Waterfall, which really warms my heart because that's where I cut my teeth and matured as a project manager using Waterfall. Well, in the year 2000s till roughly about now, Agile began to take prominence and began to become the kind of project management methods of choice. And now, this new emerging process, which the Standish Group is falling behind, called infinite flow or flow. And just maybe for our audience, before we get this topic started, if you could kind of define how you understand infinite flow as the Standish Group might present it to us.
Okay, so let's talk about what Standish means from a flow standpoint. Okay, let me give you a little bit of history. Okay, you're right. Projects and project management started off as a very analytical process. You predict something, you measure something, you do something, you measure something, and you validate that that something is what you predicted. And then you can improve on your predicting as well as your results. Um, Everything is in the plan. And that's what we call a predictive project lifecycle. Now, Standish takes its hint from something that happened in the 1970s. There was a guy by the name of Fred Brooks in 1975. He wrote a book called Mythical Man Month. Do you remember that book?
I do. In fact, I've blogged about the Mythical Man Month.
Tell me what your perspectives of that book is.
Well, probably the most emphatic part of what I remember is let's see, is if it takes a woman 9 months to produce a baby, could you have 9 women produce a baby in 1 month? And that was kind of the basis for Brooks's thought, was that just by adding people to a project does not mean you're going to progress that project any faster or more successfully.
That's correct. Actually, he goes even more further than that. Brooks get into some really interesting things in his book. Number one, it's the foundation of the triple constraint, right? Where the sponsor says, I want it fast, I want it now, and I want it cheap. You have the ability to say, please select two. And that was one of Brooks's great brainstorms in this book as well. By the way, the way Brooks came across writing this is he was the project manager in the 60s and 70s for an operating system for IBM mainframes, OS 360, in fact. And he actually experienced software development, not just, writing little apps or doing spreadsheets, writing these huge monolithic epic complex systems. And he said when you get these systems, it's the way you have to manage them is counterintuitive to the way you think project management should work. First of all, you reduce errors. But there comes a point, there's a point of diminishing returns where the act of reducing errors creates more errors. He said that progress tracking is not something that you do on a daily basis. It's what you do constantly. It's not digital. It's analog. It's every time you pass the oven, you look inside and find the status of the cookies. So there has to be a way that you can actually do these. And he found about 12 or 13 things like pilots and prototyping. This is another thing he focused on. When you talk about pilots and prototyping, you're actually looking and sampling and demonstrating on a regular basis. And I mean regular, okay? And this taking small bites, as he called it, of demonstration of certain characteristics of a deliverable on a regular basis seems to create a constant improvement instead of a stepwise, okay, we're making these improvements here, we'll do these improvements here. Instead of, you're going like this. Now, what he said was twofold. Number one, it seems to increase the rate at which you're introducing success into the project. Number two, it gives you an opportunity to explore different avenues of solutions. And one of the things he said is, if you don't lock into a solution at the beginning, you might find something using these tools that's even better than what you that you end up with. So he was just starting to define what we know of as Agile. And this was basically the birth of Agile. And from this, a bunch of other software developers took this off and said, oh, this makes really sense. And they started talking about it. And all of a sudden, non-software developers said, you know what? You're not just talking about software development. You're talking about any type of development that has uncertainty, risk, that has incredible complexity, and is prone to a lot of change. We don't want to actually do a predictive project if we know there's going to be a lot of change because it's going to be costly. But using Agile, where you keep the requirements flexible and you do this repeat with the prototypes quickly, you can actually explore without locking into requirements and still maintain a focus on objectives. This was the beautiful thing. Now, when we get, that's Agile and predictive. Standish says flow means project management is not Agile or predictive. Agile and predictive are the way we do the work. Project management is the containment, the organization, and control of that work. Project management may not change so much, but the work itself has to control. And so what Standish Group is saying is, we're looking at a future where we have skills that are agile, skills that are predictive, and they're just different skills, like arrows in our quiver. We're going to hunt bear, we're going to pull out a bear arrow. We're going to hunt birds, we're going to pull out a bird arrow. We have the proper arrow for the proper work.
So there's a couple of things that you said that kind of caught my interest. One of which was where we allow requirements to kind of be flexible, but surely we still have a prime objective for the entire project. So those requirements can't bend too much, can they?
Oh, that's the key. The objective is the focus point. For instance, build a box, okay? Let's have a box, and that box has to be black and it has to be 20 by 20 by 20 centimeters. I have requirements, right? The box itself is not the objective, okay? The box is the deliverable and its requirements. The objective, let's give a hypothetical objective. Let's say it's a box that's going to cover a switch on an assembly tool. And every time they move the assembly tool, somebody accidentally turns it on. Now, so the objective is we need to make this tool safe on the assembly floor. That's the objective. So the objective is going to stay the same. Now, and that allows us to explore, is it really a box we need? We're going to show a box prototype. We may cut it out of paper and show it to the people, and they're going to see what it looks like on the switch and that kind of thing. But maybe down on that assembly floor, they're going to say, you know what, if we put a handle here, we're not going to come near the switch, and that'll be even better and cheaper. And so the objective is what is the main focus. Now, the objective is going to be for the entire project, the deliverable itself, but the objective may be also down at the individual user level. It may be the objectives of groups of people, like a registration system at the university. You may have student objectives, counselor objectives, professor objectives, but each of these objectives are what mesh together. And that's where the integration of Agile projects occur. How do these objectives work together? And how can we actually define the features of the deliverable so it meets the individual and the collective objective?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I know when I was part of a large project management consulting firm where we went out on projects and we bid them for profit, I know that a lot of times we considered ourselves technology agnostic, shall we say. Meaning, I think just as you described it, we knew what they wanted, we knew what our clients wanted, but we also were given sort of carte blanche in terms of how to solve their problem and implement their solution. Sometimes that was an off-the-shelf product that we worked around. Sometimes one of our very clever developers would come up with a routine that made many other things, almost oblivious, or not oblivious. That's not the word I'm looking for, but obsolete based on their very creative solution. But at the end of the time period, we were paid for what we produced, and that was their prime objective, regardless of the technology that we used to produce that. Does that make sense?
It's totally. Now, this is what really clicked it for me. And I only thought about this about a year ago when I started talking about Agile in conjunction with project management in my classes. Agile is the natural way people do work. If you think about hunter-gatherers, we didn't put a plan together. We had a bunch of smart people with different skills, figure out how those skills work together and how can we best use those skills. What's the objective? We want to go home and we want to bring enough food so that we don't have to go out and hunt again tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, right? And so we have an objective and we don't know what we're going to find. Is it going to be a mammoth? Is it going to be 20 buffalo? But what we do is we find these general skills that work really well together, and we work well together as a team. And this is the mindset of an Agile team. And then the leader is just the person who makes sure that nothing gets in the way of the team. And that's how Agile works as a group.
But you still have to have those skills, correct? I mean, there's still the people with the technology. There's still, I imagine on your Agile teams, you have subject matter experts from the client perspective. And then when you put your stories together and evolve the solution towards your objective, you still have to have some order from the chaos that could otherwise result.
Oh, exactly. And with the hunter-gatherers, you're going to have people who are really good archers. You're going to have people with spears who know how to prod animals to push them over the cliff. You're going to know people who have really good eyesight. And they have all these skills that they are able to do really well. Not only that, but they have to know how their skills fit in with the team.
And let's not
Go
And
ahead.
let's not forget the chef back at the campsite who's ready to slice and dice that carcass into something delicious, right?
Exactly, exactly. Now, getting back into our current world, it works the same way. You have your subject experts, you have your possible solutions, but you have this general expertise, what we call knowledge working. This is, and this is really interesting. Back in the early 20th century, you had a bunch of futurists like Buckminster Fuller and Peter Drucker and Deming. I talk about these all the time, and they were all saying the same thing. We're moving out of industrialization, right? We're no longer skills-based. We're moving into an information-based economy, which is really strange. And we're having to become knowledge workers. Fuller was very careful to express that knowledge workers are what made humanity successful in the prehistoric times. Now, Drucker and Deming said knowledge workers are what's going to allow us to remain relevant, even though our jobs are going to be going away basically for the next 40 years. Automation is going to replace almost everything. And so the knowledge workers are the ones who are going to be most successful, which means Standish is saying that as we move, we're going to have to adopt work that's more complex, more uncertain, more prone to change, and we're going to need to be a group of knowledge workers, not just have deep expertise, but we
Well,
have to understand. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, and that makes total sense to me. I know when I think back to the projects that I managed near the start of my career versus though I was part of a project management organization on huge projects towards the end of my career as a full-time on-site project manager, the complexity was exponentially or almost every project was more complex than the previous one. And when you're trying to manage a team of 200 or 300 people trying to come up with that same objective, then it makes so much more sense that you have these knowledge-based workers that can not only bring a team together, but make that team hum as they move forward to achieve those objectives. And I can see their point, Standish point exactly.
And that's where they get that idea of flow. Number one, it's not predictive or agile. Take those out of the conversation. Flow is the support and development of people through leadership and understanding of groups such that progress is constant.
Well, and that makes total sense because if you really think about it, agile, predictive, or what I called waterfall, or even a hybrid, those are just methodologies to get the work done. Project management becomes that kind of containing process, and it has its own methodology in many ways. And if Standish is and in fact, let me go back a little bit in my career. I remember specifically those long 2, 3, 4-year projects where you worked in that predictive model for months on end, and the deliverable, the approval of one deliverable allows you to progress to the next so that you refined and refined and refined, and finally you came to the solution. It was a long time to wait for 2 to 3 years to see that final product. And you would end up with not only us as developers being impatient with seeing the final result, but the poor client who's paying all of this money is waiting forever for their final result. So I can see where this thing called flow, as they've named it, or infinite flow, where and using some of the agile thoughts behind it, I can see from my own process, from my own mind, that from a customer point of view and from a developer point of view, you're seeing results as you move along. And so it's a much more satisfying model in terms of what we're developing.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Now,
Yeah.
I have a question for you. As we move out of this age of Agile into a flow model, Chaos says we're moving out of curation, which is managing projects, to leadership of projects. Okay. Now, do you think there's a role for management or curation? Do you think it still belongs in projects and project management?
I think it does, specifically because, as I mentioned, whether you have 30 people on a project or 300 people in the project, somehow someone has to organize those people. And typically organization and someone also has to say, well, this is where we are right now. Let's take a look at these tasks at this point. So along those lines, as people do their very specific jobs in a project, someone has to be kind of seeing the whole as the sum of its parts and being able to manage that process. It doesn't mean that, as you mentioned earlier, that leadership is not involved, because it clearly is. You want to get the most out of your teams, most out of every individual. But I think there still is that curation or that management process whereby the day-to-day, and I hate to say this, these details that are so important don't get lost.
Number of defects. That's one of those details.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're behind by 3.5 days. That's another detail. You're exactly right. You have to have a combination of both. The problem is we all start off managing projects because it's a technical skill, and you can learn technical skills a lot easier than you learn attributes like leadership and self-awareness. Those take years of polish and refinement to become effective. And so we start off with management, and we slowly transition over a decade and a half to acquire these leadership skills. This is natural and normal for humans. I think one of the things that we have not done well in the project management industry is formal training and making sure everybody understands that this is the way humans are. It takes time to learn how to work with people. It doesn't take a lot of time to learn how to work with Excel. And you work well with people when you observe good leaders instead of just studying from a book.
Oh, that's exactly correct. And now if this future flow process comes into being, and the leadership becomes much more important, so that you do get the most out of every person. I'll tell you what, when I've had particularly young people right out of college, even, who are exuberant and want to show off their skills and want to do a good job, if you can just kind of corral them within some sort of straightforward confinement, they will surprise you with their innovation and their ability to succeed in terms of some of the objectives that you're trying to achieve. So you, as a manager, if you're using management skills on that kind of exuberance, you can actually temper it or damp it down. Whereas if you use leadership skills and get the most out of it while you're working within the confines of that project, you'd be surprised at how quickly many of these developers or analysts or subject matter experts excel and drive your project forward even faster.
Yep. And that's why they say that the soldiers win the battle and the generals lose the war. I have so many students that push back on that. It's the leadership that makes the projects really successful. The work is successful because you're going to bring in good people for the specific work. But the application and the direction and the influence that you give the people in the teams is what you create. What you talk about is a successful project. Yeah.
Well, and when I first started reading about what Standish was thinking in terms of infinite flow or whatever they're going to eventually call it, when I started reading about that, and I'm thinking, what's the role now of the project manager? Are we going to end up basically not needing project managers? And then I thought for a while, I'm thinking, no, we need more skilled project management, project leadership persons, people who are truly motivated by the act of leadership rather than the details of the project plan and ticking off tasks on a schedule that's mounted on a wall somewhere. And I think, and as you mentioned before, I'm still intrigued by this whole idea of fluid requirements, because again, coming from the predictive model, once you approve those requirements, it takes a change request to change a requirement. So having a set of fluid requirements, having people who are true leaders, as well as can manage at the detail level, I think this this new process, or this new thought around project management processes, allows project managers with higher skills to excel in their careers even faster.
Yes. Now, think about it this way too. If you look at a corporation as different levels of leaders, you have a person who's an individual contributor, and they're so good that somebody promotes them to be a manager of workers. And that manager of workers has to acquire new skills. They can't push people out of the way and do the work anymore. They have to learn how to teach and direct those workers in doing that work. Now, if they get really good at that, they're promoted again, which means they're a leader of leaders. You have to have a whole bunch of other skills now. Now you can't even get into the training, and you can't even get into the progress of the individual teams or groups. You have to be working with the trainers, and you're doing a lot of train the trainer stuff. You're still having the same objective. The corporate objectives aren't different, but they're different for the workers, for the first line managers, and for the business managers. And it goes on and on and on and on. Each level of management has its own skills that it has to acquire. And what we're saying is the transition that we're looking at in project management is we're moving from directing workers, which is frontline management, to directing leaders and managers of workers. So we're becoming executives. Now, it gets really interesting here. Twofold. There's a twofold reason why it's interesting. Number one, we're going to have to train others. Number two, we're going to have to keep moving ourselves up. Now, and one of the hardest things to convince students in my classes is, if I train other people, they're not going to replace me. They're going to move me up. So if I actually am able to grow and develop great leaders, they're not going to push me out. Those great leaders I'm developing are going to push me up. So this bodes well for the career path of project management and our individual opportunities. It allows us to move up and down in project management, and it allows us to move out into business management as well, which is a real unique opportunity.
Not only that, is what I learned later in my career was, if I hired people who are smarter than me, they will push me up faster because they're much more receptive to a leadership model that allows them themselves to progress. So it's worked well for us in the past. You know, when I was thinking about the Standish Group also, I followed them kind of at a loose level for some time, because I got interested in this thought process around why we as why we in the industry have such a huge failure rate. And one of the things that Standish does, every couple of years, they produce this report. I think they go through about 50,000 worldwide projects to determine the success levels. And I've been kind of watching them over the years, and I noticed that there was a bit of a leap from 2 years ago to this year, but we're still at like only about a 31% success rate, which is still better than the 19% success rate from a couple of years ago. But I'm thinking what's happening, and I'm thinking, this is just me now thinking out loud, is that having watched this progress being incremental, I think people are realizing, people in the industry are realizing that with process, we can only go so far. You can only tweak so many more good ideas into a process model to develop a project. But if you can't stimulate the people to progress, you're never going to kind of get those leaps so that you're much more predictable, closer to the 100% success rate than we are right now. And I'm wondering if Standish, looking back at what it's seen, if they're saying, wait a minute, this old process, whether it's tied up in IEEE models or PMI models or whatever, which are process-based largely, if these are not, in fact, not going to get us where we need to be, and we have to look at something differently. And I wonder if that's where this whole idea of infinite flow comes from.
It's transitioning away from process. And again, like Brooks said, there's a point where eliminating defects hits diminishing returns, where eliminating defects and trying to get improvement just through improving process is not going to get it. What is going to get it is innovation. We see this in economics, right? It's funny that all of this stuff is happening right now in our society. GDP, gross domestic product, throughout the 20th century was driven primarily through our ability to utilize our resources and take greater amounts of resources and create more GDP. And we know where that's led us, right? We're running out of coal, we're running out of oil, and we're running out of other things. There are other economic models that are coming to the forefront. One of them is called the donut economic model, or donut economics, which says that there is a finite amount of resources, and then there are needs of our society. And what we want to do is minimize the needs of society such that we have more GDP, which gets really strange. You're capping your resources and you're still able to create greater value. And how do you do that? Innovation. Innovation is the driver. Now, this is going to carry us back to our conversation here in one moment. One more piece. Innovation carries it with it different ideas. Different ideas lead us to argument and to conflict. So we're going to have to train and grow our people to help understand that conflict is a natural consequence of being humans, and you have to learn how to effectively manage conflict, which means we have to not just demonstrate leadership skills as project managers, we have to ensure that everybody embraces them, because the solution to what we're looking for, not just in projects, but in society itself, is the ability to manage conflict in such a way we can actually get to the innovation and come up with the best ideas.
That makes sense also. And I was just thinking of some of my projects where we have these dyed in the wool men and women who have always done it this way. And I imagine there's a lot of conflict created on projects because you don't want to lose their expertise. But at the same time, you just want to get them to kind of change their mindset such that they go along with the new processes. Not new because you want something new, but new because you truly are making leaps and strides in terms of your success rate. So what do you think? Do we have situations where we have conflict with those people who have always done it this way?
Oh, of course. It's safe. It's comfortable. I don't have to change. this is what keeps us successful. If I have something that's given me success in the past, I have every expectation that it's going to be successful. And it's going to take a lot of convincing to prove me otherwise. And again, this is not just common. This is essential behavior of humans. This is a survival mechanism. And we're actually working against those survival mechanisms when we're trying to influence and motivate and convince and persuade. But there are well-known ways to do this. They're teachable and they're learnable.
Absolutely. So I know you and I have had conversations also in the past, but how, I noticed that the PMBOK version 7 that's being written or being produced right now, probably in its final edits, I think it's scheduled to be delivered to us in August or something of 2021. Knowing what they're kind of doing, what they, PMI, are kind of doing with the move from version 6 to version 7, do you think they've collaborated with Standish, or do you think some of their new innovations are based on what Standish has observed over the last several years?
They have been greatly influenced by the chaos reports. They follow it. It's one of the primary research tools they do in forecasting the needs of project managers and updating the exam and updating the standards. Yeah, it's a primary driver. But then again, the authors, you have up to 50 authors, and they're reading the same books I am, right? They're reading the Drucker and they're reading the Deming, and they're doing the research like you and I do, and they're seeing the writing on the wall too. It's again, we're capping out on the ability for our technical refinement to improve performance. And we're going to have to start transitioning to the human factors. And this is a societal cycle too. When you have a society is lazy. It's going to solve the easy problems first. Later on, it's going to start to tackle the big complex issues that are the ugly ones. And that's what we're heading towards here. This is a very complex situation that we're going to be entering, going from post-industrialization to a knowledge economy. And we don't know what that looks like. And therefore, they're using Standish and they're using all of these academic material to actually not just forecast, but give a level of confidence to the direction that they're going. Now, this direction is interesting. Have you had a chance to actually look through the material that they're just releasing about the PMBOK?
I did, and I'll tell you what warmed the cockles of my heart was all of these years that I have been very strident in my thought process around the fact that we put way too much emphasis on process, and how much the PMBOK contributes to that up until the version 6. How much it contributes to that, I'm not sure, but I do know that in a lot of the projects I've been on, we still have box checkers and Gantt chart followers, and not that that's wrong, because you do need that. But somehow the process kept getting in the way of, as we mentioned before, innovation. And so one of the things that intrigued me was that the leap from version 6 of the PMBOK to version 7 moves from those 5 processes that we're so used to into something called principles. And to me, principles is much more satisfying as a project manager, because as long as I stay adhere to those principles in terms of what I'm doing as a project manager, it doesn't mean the process goes away, but it means that I'm really adhere to those principles, because that's what's going to guide me to that finish line. So when I saw that, I don't know what that looks like yet, but as I read about the kind of the teaser that they've been throwing out, that really quickened my thought process around that we are absolutely making a leap forward to the right, in the right direction.
Great. Let's paint a picture. Okay. So some of the details that have been made public is the PMBOK itself, 7th edition, is going to be 200 pages. It's up to about 700 pages right now. So they're going to get rid of a lot of content. And we can assume the content they're going to get rid of is a lot of this process oriented, right? Process groups, knowledge areas, inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs. I'll talk about where those are going here in a second. Now, they're going to be pushing out these Agile components too. And they're going to leave a general framework. And they call this general framework a collection of performance domains. And there's 8 of them. So there's going to be measurement. There isn't going to be Agile measurement or predictive measurement. There's not going to be Agile uncertainty versus predictive uncertainty. There's not going to be Agile stakeholders or predictive stakeholders. They're just going to be stakeholders. Okay, so this is the framework that they're giving. Now, with that in mind, they're pushing out all these Agile versus predictive details. They're pushing out of all these process details, and they're pushing it into a knowledge base that they're calling Standards Plus. You can go out to the PMI website right now and look up Standards Plus, standards with the plus sign on it, and it'll actually show you a new website that's there. That right now there are a bunch of videos, but their plan is to create it as a knowledge base where you can find templates, you can find webinars, you can find videos, all sorts of stuff that you can use to get into the specific details. So it's an archival knowledge arena, right? A repository of lessons learned where you can actually have the PMBOK as a broad structure that says, here's what projects are, here's what project management is, go to work and pull out what you need. The tailoring doesn't eliminate. The tailoring is taking this thin 200-page framework and adding to it just what's necessary.
Well, and that also helped me understand a little bit more about this new version. And again, tied to the Standish Group, the whole idea of flow, because I think so much during my consulting career, when we had to bid projects, a lot of times the only reason we won was because of our innovation. And what we would do in our proposals to the organization we were bidding to, in those proposals, we would take what they had asked for in their request for proposals, and we would innovate certain pieces, i.e. tailor certain pieces that just leaped off the page in terms of making sense. And a lot of times we won just because of that tailoring, so that every single project wasn't a cookie cutter of the other one. So I'm thinking that what you just described with the new process, there's much more permission given to tailoring. In fact, it's expected because every client is different, every project is different. And if we have this continuous flow, I suspect that means we go from development to implementation to ongoing operations as a single project, which never ends, basically. We have to be able to tailor. We have to be able to be innovative. And especially once you have a system that's working well and some new technology comes forward and you want to tweak it to improve it some more, you want to be able to keep improving and keep moving. So I really applaud what they're doing with that whole fostering of tailoring even more.
Yeah, and it's funny because I remember one of my mentors saying and smiling at me and saying, Tim, I give you permission to change that because he knew that I thought it was a rule and a law to use a certain template, and he just chuckled to himself. And I see what my mentor was coming up with when I have students going through and they're saying, do you mean that the PMBOK's not a book of rules? No, it's a bunch of people over the last 2 centuries who said, this is a good way of doing things. If you find a better way, tell us. And it's basically, that's all it is. It's good practice. And a standard is good practice. It's not rules and laws.
in good practice and good guidance, I think, from that perspective. And
Yeah, it's advice. Yeah,
it
guidance, advice.
may be part of moving the process into a separate area. I know that part of when I went through the PMBOK itself, and I've probably read every single page of at least the 4, 5, and 6. When I've gone through the PMBOK itself, I noticed that there was a lot of repetition, which makes sense because you're going to delve into this piece and you want the whole thing. So for example, expert judgment comes up. Well, it comes up in estimating, it comes up in process work, it comes up in collaboration, it comes up in all of the different areas. Expert judgment. What are we as project managers if we don't have expert judgment? So I think if we move that out, we can clearly condense what it is that we see. And I like the whole idea of 200 pages. You mentioned stakeholders earlier, which caught my eye because I think we've talked about this before, but I just recall this so much because a lot of times the stakeholders had the initial vision for the project. And then it's like, okay, I've hired you experts now. I can now kind of go off to the side. I'm thinking that with these new performance domains where one of them focuses itself on stakeholders, that stakeholders, being the initial visionaries, must remain project bound to continue the vision and to make sure it doesn't kind of go off the rails. So I'm seeing stakeholders being really important, more important than they ever were.
Yeah, 15 to 20 years of failing Agile projects have taught us that this type of work fails from the top. It's the support, it's the executive support of Agile that has kept it from being implemented with its full value inside the corporate environment. That's not just true for, it's not just true for Agile. It's true for everything. The executive, management, all these have an important role in Agile. You don't walk away from Agile projects. You can't, because you are what needs. You are the need and the desire that drives the project. Without that, why should there be any work? And so we have to actually train our stakeholders, which is weird. I had to get used to this when the exam content outline changed last year, and that influenced the exam in January. Training is not just for teams. Training is for stakeholders as well. Setting expectations is a form of training my stakeholders. Getting their buy-in, mentoring them. All of these things mean that we're going to engage, we're going to support, we're going to motivate and influence. We've always known this from a general leadership standpoint. Now we're learning why, we're learning the purpose of servant leadership and how important it is. And that's what the value of the Standish report and the concept of flow is. Because if you get it right on a project, you can get it right in an organization, you can get it right inside the company. NASA, with their implementation of PMOs, there's about 5 or 6 white papers out on the PMI website. I think you can get them through projectmanagement.com too. They crashed and burned 5 or 6 times on implementing project management offices because you needed support from the executive standpoint to maintain and set aside the head count for a PMO. And you also need the desire and the effort from the project managers, and you need them working together for a successful PMO. You need them together for a successful implementation of Agile. For business success, we're starting to learn or relearn that you need to have that engagement, both from bottom up and from top down.
Well, you do, and I know from some of the projects that I've witnessed PMOs being part of, if the PMO is set up to be like an internal affairs department, it just gets in the way. Nobody trusts it. Nobody wants to deal with it. So if it becomes, as you were mentioning, and some of these process or performance domains now help the process, whereby they can truly influence the stakeholders, the teams, the choice for the methodology, the choice for estimating models. They can influence all of that based on the needs of the organization and the existing skills of the organization. So I can see where a lot of this is going to be launching us into a new formation of excellence in terms of managing our projects, or I shouldn't say managing, I should say leading our projects to success.
Yeah, and again, this is not a pivot. This is an evolutionary step. We saw this in understanding how projects can be collective in programs. And we also saw it in projects and programs where we can move it to a balanced ledger in portfolios. And I believe this is mimicking that evolution. So again, this is not a pivot. This is an evolutionary change.
Well, we talked earlier in terms of the future for a project manager, or for the skills of a project manager. Portfolio management suddenly becomes much more challenging and complex than just taking a single project and driving it home. Because my number one DBA that I need for my new project is also my number one DBA who understands my legacy system and some of the things that I'm going to be doing there. So how am I balancing now when I've only got one of these incredible technical whiz kids? How am I now going to balance the new development with its timelines versus the ongoing? So that's just one little example of the kinds of things that can happen. Where do I bring in 20 new developers to make something happen and then release them? In other words, I can't necessarily employ everybody, but now I have to balance employees against contracted employees. So you're looking at all kinds of challenges that you never had before when you're managing a portfolio.
Yeah, and you have to have mature relationships with finance. You have to have mature relationships with legal. You have to have mature relationships with your product owners and your functional managers. And so it's asking a lot more of project managers. So as this transition continues, we're going to mature at least the rate that our team has to mature, which again bodes very well for the opportunities for project management and project managers.
Makes me want to come out of my consulting in process to back to actually on the floor running projects, but maybe not so much.
Well, and again, it was interesting because when I was learning how to be a consultant, they said, here's project management. It's an Excel sheet. It's checking off boxes. Here's consulting. It's a relationship.
Yep.
And so I differentiated consulting from project management as leadership from project management. And one of the mindsets that we get as a consultant is you're not delivering a deliverable. You're providing a solution to a problem. You're not delivering a deliverable. You're delivering value. And this is where we can actually not just command better salaries, but we can have true relevance inside of a business environment.
Well, true relevance. And I also found that in my consulting career, I went on my own. When I say on my own, it's my own independent firm in 2003. So it's been several years. And what I found was that even though I didn't have direct responsibilities in terms of people management, because the client that would hire me wouldn't hire me to manage the people. They would hire me to, as you said, add value. But it's interesting how the difference between just managing process versus becoming a consultant to your end user or to your client, it's your ability to influence and persuade that suddenly allows you to become not their direct manager, but certainly someone that they go to for advice and for continued thought processes around what they're doing. So yes, you become a valued member of that organization, even though you don't have direct responsibilities as a manager over staff. It's a totally different mindset.
Very good. And it's a well-walked path. We have Peter Drucker, we have Deming, we have all the Greeks and Roman philosophers that are back there. We have all these wise statesmen. We have all this stuff to rely on that tell us this is the direction we're going, and we can move in confidence in this direction, not just because we've personally experienced it, but because we have millennia of experience that says this is the best way to do business. And if you do this, you can actually maintain a safe society, not just, hold on while things happen, randomly around you.
And yet, after all those millennia, we still have a lot of project failure. So somehow, I'm really looking forward to learning more about this whole process that Standish and PMI are bringing forward, because I think I'm expecting the 2022 report from Standish to pump up that success rate even higher than what we're seeing now. So
yeah, I'm just as curious as you are to see where the numbers are, but I'm really curious to hear the response from the rest of the public. If any of you watching this, either in real time or through recording, have your comments or your questions, please send it to us, and we'll continue talking about this. The 7th edition of the PMBOK comes out August 1st, and it's going to be in parallel with the 6th edition for a time, so we get to be able to actually compare peanuts to peanuts for a little bit.
well, that's going to be interesting. I didn't realize that, because I think when we went from 5 to 6, didn't we just kind of put 5 aside?
No, actually, it was out there for about 3 months while we had 6, and then 2 months after 5 was pulled, that's when the exam changed.
Oh, I see. Okay. Because when I was blogging, and by the way, I blogged on every single process within the project management body of knowledge. But when I was doing that, there was times that I was quoting from release 5 or edition 5, because I liked the way it described things better than the 6th edition. So yeah, I think there's value in all of that. I'm not going to throw away my past models, but I am looking forward to number 7.
Myself as well. And again, the information in the 6th edition isn't going away.
Right.
It's just being squeezed out and put in that knowledge repository. And I'm interested in public response to the repository as well as the standard.
So maybe a year from now, we'll have to do one of these podcasts just on the repository and see what people are finding.
That would be clever. That would be fun.
It would. I think we've got lots of material here to look forward to, and I'm really looking forward to. They mentioned, was it the project management standards that they're adding? Was that the 200 pages? They're doing something that is ANSI approved. I think it's the project management standards.
It could be. It could very well be. Yeah.
I'm looking to see that synthesized as well into one place.
Yeah, and that would make sense. Actually, the 2000 version of the PMBOK was when it was aligned with the ANSI standards.
Okay.
And it's always been there, but those pieces are what are being pushed out. Now, the PMBOK will still be aligned with ISO 21500.
And that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have exhausted what we know about this. Well, no, I don't think we've exhausted what we know. We've certainly exhausted this 1 hour in talking about this whole process. And as you mentioned, those people who are listening, who have come across their own readings, I'd love to have you contribute to our body of knowledge with what you've observed so far as Standish moves forward and as PMI moves forward.
Yes, yes, please. We invite all comments, questions, and participation. And if you're passionate about this, we'd love to talk to you about it.
And probably, as we wrap up, Tim, probably the easiest way to talk to us about this is on LinkedIn. You can find Timothy Jerome or Tim Jerome on LinkedIn and Merv Jersak on LinkedIn. And just let us know some of your thoughts, even on some of the content here. And
That would be wonderful.
And we'll see you same time, same place next week at this time.
Thanks for the opportunity, Merv. Thank you for listening in today, and we'll continue our conversation next week.
Fantastic. See you next week.